What happens when you combine rigid Castlevania 64 platforming, Resident Evil shooting mechanics, turn-based attacks from Pokemon,
Right, that's sir! Whoa! Looks like a bad Pokemon choice!
and moves from a wrestling game? Hybrid Heaven is certainly an appropriate title. It's an action RPG turn-based fighting game, in which you fight aliens hand-to-hand to rescue the president and prevent an alien invasion. It's fallen into obscurity, but it has some very interesting mechanics that the 64 probably wasn't capable of highlighting. It's said that being ahead of your time is just as bad as being behind your time. Hybrid Heaven is a pretty good example of this principle. Platforming, shooting, and fighting make up the majority of the gameplay. The downside is that they got 1 out of 3 right, and even then it's got problems. Platforming feels stiff at best. Rigid jumps, slow climbing animations, and bad ledge detection make it tedious to move through the levels. Most puzzles consist of shootable switches and computer terminals that upgrade your keycard, which gets really repetitive. The gun, which is called the diffuser in the game, is used to take out the robotic enemies and activate switches. It has the same aiming style seen in the early Resident Evil games. You hit the button and you're locked in place, and the analog stick is used to pan left, right, up, and down. When looking up or down, there's no in between. You're either looking at the ceiling or the floor. And since the aiming is clunky, the hit detection is programmed to be extremely generous. Combine that with underwhelming sound effects, and you have a shooting mechanic that really doesn't feel that great. The hand-to-hand fighting is the most fleshed out mechanic in the game. All fights are one-on-one battles in a large room. Attacking, defending, and moving are tied to the power bar, which slowly recharges over time. You can move around as it charges, but it will drain, or deplete rapidly if you run or dash. The stamina bar is tied to your grapple moves and sprinting with the Z button. When it gets low, grapples become far less effective. To take your turn, you hit the A button, which gives you the option to fight, use weapons, or use healing or buff items. Every attack uses either the power bar, which needs to be at least 20% full, or one of the blue reserve bars that store when your power bar fills. As you progress, your character gains more blue bars, which allows for combination strikes and the ability to strike or grapple a downed opponent. When the opponent takes their turn, you are given a few options to defend yourself. In most cases, you can either step away to avoid the attack, guard to mitigate damage, or attempt to counter the attack with the very move used against you, and if you don't have that specific move, a substitute is chosen from your character's move list. The defensive options are unreliable at best. Block will not always work, step won't dodge a projectile in most cases, and the counter puts you in a parry state that seems to work around 5% of the time. There are 3 different types of attacks: punches, kicks, and grapples. Punches are fast but lack range. Kicks have long range and power but are much slower. And grapples, which includes wrestling moves and submissions, are powerful but situational, requiring either a grapple state or a downed opponent. Your character seems to learn new moves by leveling up or by having the moves used on them. As you perform techniques, your body grows in strength depending on which moves you use most frequently. Each limb has an offensive and defensive stat. Punches improve the strength of your arms, and kicking will do the same for your legs. Defending works the same way. When you block, the limb used to defend will improve. Generally, it's best to level both arms or both legs at the same time, since injury sustained during a fight will stop that limb from working. Enemies also have limb durability, which means you can temporarily disable an arm, a leg, or even head for advantage. Grapples scale with your body and head offensive stats, but the downside is that some enemies are immune to grapples, which makes the wrestler build somewhat limiting, which is a shame, because it's probably the most interesting style. The story is a mess. Act 1 starts with Johnny, a presidential bodyguard who is involved in a conspiracy to assassinate the president. He is tasked by his superior, Kevin, to meet Diaz.
Make contact with Mr. Diaz in New York. He'll bring the tools and the weapons you need.
We also hear his girlfriend on the answering machine, who talks about their promise to one another to meet under a certain tree on Christmas Day.
Are you doing okay?
Johnny enters the subway and walks past his girlfriend, who he doesn't seem to recognize. He's approached by Diaz and 2 other agents. Suddenly Diaz shoots Johnny, and then is apprehended by the 2 agents. He's then dragged to the underground facility. He fights them off and we begin the game there, playing as Diaz. In the underground facility, the first generic NPC gives Diaz the code key, which needs to be updated at terminals to progress through the game. A second NPC explains how the security system will react to anyone, friend or foe, and how to defend yourself from robots with the diffuser. Diaz then activates a computer, which turns out to be the release mechanism for the biological weapons, or hybrids. After running into an NPC who labels Diaz a traitor, he is stabbed and we get our first fight against a hybrid monster with claws for hands. At this point it's a pretty good idea to choose which fighting style you're going to use. I used the Zidane build, kicks and the occasional headbutt.
Oh, wow.
The next NPC teaches Diaz about the map we see in the bottom right corner of the screen. The rooms in your minimap are represented by various shades of green depending on your elevation, which is a mess. So good luck traversing through an area with multiple levels. In some areas, hybrids will spawn out of yellow tiles, and spawn again a limited number of times if the player leaves the room and re-enters. It's a good idea to grind a little because the bosses can get pretty challenging in the later half of the game. To make this process slightly less painful, you can ambush an enemy from behind and gain a full stamina bar. But if you're not careful, the enemy can get you with a surprise attack if you're facing the wrong way, giving them a full stamina bar. Chests and lockers with items will become more frequent as you wander off the beaten path. These will save you a few headaches, since healing is limited to save points and consumables. After being taught how to body slam by the green, face-chested hybrid, we run into an NPC who gives us a little insight into what Diaz has done. Diaz is an executive in this shadow organization. Killing Johnny and releasing the hybrids is clearly some sort of betrayal. The first boss of the game is a red dinosaur hybrid who specializes in grappling, and can activate an energy wave if you get too close. Apparently he doesn't know the difference between a vertical suplex and a brainbuster.
Go for a super play, oh no! Brainbuster!
Once defeated, we start Act 2. Diaz is knocked out with a blunt katana and we meet our main cast of villains. Hunter, who's the second in command, and Jerry, who specializes in brainwashing. Hunter outs himself, Diaz, and Jerry as hybrids. He accuses Diaz of sabotaging the invasion of the Overground. They reveal that Diaz is an analog, a hybrid made to replace a real human, and that the Master plans on creating an analog of the President to help him overtake the human race. They reveal that Johnny, the man who was shot by Diaz, was a Secret Service presidential aide, who they had planned on making an analog version of, but couldn't because of what Diaz had done.
Why did you shoot?
Confused? Don't worry, it gets worse. Hunter instructs Jerry to brainwash Diaz, who is forced into a pod but is rescued by someone, and is instructed to run. Diaz escapes into Floor 21, the research station led by Dr. Bross, a psychotic hybrid fascinated by scientific experimentation. He releases a giant xenomorph to chase you through the area. Diaz outruns the xenomorph, or he would have if I didn't screw up the event, and a perfect square is blown out of the wall. We speak to the Gargantuans, and run into the biggest exposition dump in the entire game. The Gargantuans are a pacifist alien race from another planet known for their intelligence. They claim that in order to travel through space, they placed themselves under hibernation. Unfortunately, a traitor within their race left them in stasis longer than planned. The traitor became a dictator and forced the other Gargantuans to invade Earth, using hybrid clones and body doubles for the invasion. The Gargantuans explain that Diaz is actually Johnny Slater, the guy we killed in the intro. Through a combination of brainwashing and body swapping, Johnny, disguised as Diaz, was used to kill the fake Johnny, who was a hybrid, and the real Diaz is being kept by the Gargantuans in stasis. They then describe the traitor's plan, to clone the president and all of his aides in order to take over America. Johnny is then given his real body back, and we play through the remainder of the game as Johnny. The Gargantuans are then ambushed by Jerry, who demands that they return Diaz. The real Johnny emerges from an explosion, and we continue into Act 3. Johnny reaches a new area of the base, containing hybrids with new moves and more gun and switch puzzles. At this point we can use 3-hit combos, and I really want to put names on these to differentiate them, and other unfortunate reasons.
Not so nice on the initials, but King Kofi Kingston sounds great.
After fighting DJ Roomba, we run into some important clone chambers, and with the use of clever environmental storytelling, we see which hybrids have already infiltrated society, and the ones who are still in the process of being cloned, which is bookended by the reveal of the president's empty cloning chamber. Johnny runs into his superior, Kevin, who orders Johnny to enter the elevator. Kevin quickly realizes that he is speaking to the real Johnny Slater and reveals himself as a hybrid. Johnny is grabbed by the agent, and Kevin claims that he has already successfully cloned the president. Chasing after Kevin, we see him place the president in a cloning chamber and blow up a bridge to help Johnny. Kevin continues to taunt Johnny, point out the flaws in human society, and then gets personal by mocking Johnny and his girlfriend, who works for the UN headquarters, and probably thinks he's dead after seeing his hybrid die. We eventually corner Kevin, who reveals his true hybrid form.
Crazy 800-pound silverback bursting through the trees.
Johnny finds the real president and a Gargantuan, who saves the president from a memory wipe. As the president recovers, we speak to the Gargantuans, who warn Johnny of the consequences of the US being controlled by the traitor. The president remarks on the timing of the invasion. It's occurring during peace agreements with Russia. The Gargantuans ask you to retrieve the Navigator so that they can leave and avoid further conflict. Johnny, with Holly in his mind, agrees to the plan, and we begin Act 4. After some more platforming, shooting and fighting, we start to run into more mechanical enemies who can fire rockets at Johnny, and the area itself has become more industrial. We run through large open spaces with flamethrower and turret traps to stop us. There are some great camera angles that really show the scale of the base that we've been trapped in. We fight another boss with a diffuser, a robot with various projectiles, and it's awful. Constant knockdowns and movement too slow to reliably react to his attacks. For the first time since his revival, we run into the original Diaz, who feels humiliated by the actions that Johnny took in his original body, and swears to hunt him down, leaving behind an injured Gargantuan who reminds Johnny of the significance of the Navigator, and then dies in Johnny's arms. This sets the tone for Act 5. We are greeted with unsettling background music and harsh red lighting. At this point in the game, the atmosphere really comes into its own. We get dynamic camera angles and stingers that come straight from a horror movie, which, considering we fight the mummy hand to hand, is a little bit odd. The area is filled with force fields that require multiple switches to deactivate, which gets a bit tedious, until we run into the boss fight against the 4 elemental fiends, who use ice, fire, wind, and poison. What the hell am I looking at? After defeating the fiends, we rescue the Navigator, who decides to fuse with Johnny so he can reach the pedestal in order to control the ship. After the fusion, we begin Act 6. Johnny once again runs into Bros, the mad scientist that I genuinely forgot existed.
I had to take notes on everyone.
Jerry orders Bros to capture Johnny, informing him that he is fused with the Navigator. But seeing an opportunity for more experiments, Bros turns off the transmission and throws Johnny into a pit to fight two of the giant xenomorphs from the earlier chapter. Here we have to trick them into firing on one another, and then trick the remaining into falling off a cliff. Finally we fight Bros, who, for a scientist, is tough as nails. He uses stat buff items, multi-shot guns, and for some reason has a wide range of submissions that do crazy damage. I died to him at least 4 times. After beating him, we travel back to the Gargantuan base, only to find no one but a woman named Anna who pretends to be captive, only to stun Johnny. As it turns out, she's working with Diaz, who turned his back on the Master in his quest for revenge against Johnny. Diaz attempts to shoot Johnny, but the shelter collapses and separates them. Then we begin Act 7. Act 7 reuses older areas in reverse, only this time we see the damage that has taken its toll on the ship. We find rooms partially flooded, sections of fire and debris block off areas, but somehow DJ Roomba is still around.
Jerry! You stepped on DJ Roomba!
Eventually, we reach the birth area. We run into Anna, without a disguise. As we speak with Anna, the water becomes tainted and Anna panics, since she's responsible for raising the hybrids as a mother. She flees into the control room and we follow. We run into a room that has infinitely spawning enemies, so I took the time to grind out some stats because I didn't want to suffer again. We run into Jerry and Anna having an argument. After seeing the waters of life get tainted, Anna, much like Diaz, has an existential crisis and breakdown. Seeing her children die because the Master's contingency plan involves destroying his own base is too much for her, and she sees this action as an obvious betrayal. After some philosophical discussion about clones and their envy of the original counterparts, Hunter denies Anna's claims as delusional. Regardless, Anna decides to side with Johnny. She decides to escape with Johnny, but can't outrun the explosion. And we start Act 8. This area reuses the somber music from an earlier chapter, and uses a flashing red light that persists for a while. This makes the area feel oppressive and looks great during fights. We run into Jerry, who is screaming at Hunter because he isn't allowed to go overground. After almost giving up on the hybrids, Jerry is then motivated by Hunter to capture the Navigator along with Johnny. As the base collapses, we confront Jerry, who, despite having doubts about his actions, decides to fight Johnny because getting to the surface is his only desire. Thankfully, this fight isn't nearly as bad as Bros. He uses a gun a decent bit, but nothing too crazy otherwise. After kicking him in the shin, he is defeated. The base collapses as Johnny enters the starship. He confronts Hunter, who has the President and some Gargantuans hostage. The traitor, otherwise known as the Master, finally reveals himself. He praises Johnny and confirms Anna's suspicion that he is comfortable sacrificing his allies to achieve his goals. He reveals his plan to create clones of Johnny for his personal army. He commands Hunter to fight Johnny and creates a barrier for the two to fight in. The fight is tough. Hunter uses quick projectiles that do 400 damage, and he uses a triple shot that does 750, so staying close is much more effective.
He never uses that sword from earlier though.
We confront the Master, who is furious and cannot understand Johnny's resilience. He uses telekinesis on Johnny and almost kills him before the President comes in with the assist, and then we fight the Master. The Master levitates away from the player and specializes in range attacks. If you manage to get too close, he will knock you back with an energy wave. The trick is to attack him just as he begins to charge his energy attack. After defeating him, Johnny rescues the President and the Gargantuans. Johnny returns the Navigator to the control room, and the gang plan on exposing the hybrid imposters as the peaceful Gargantuans leave the planet. But the Master is still alive. A parasite possessing the Master reveals itself and calls itself Migoa? It takes responsibility for the Master's plan to consume all life on Earth, and he transforms into an armadillo and we fight. He has insane attack speed and a crazy amount of projectiles. Thankfully this fight can be cheesed by staying on his side to avoid his breath attacks and tail whips, which can stun lock you if you're not careful. In his second phase, he becomes much more humanoid, using grapples to his advantage and still has a projectile if you try and keep your distance. After defeating Migoa, the President reflects on the nature of the parasite and then begins the escape sequence. But before they can escape on the elevator, Diaz attacks. Johnny forces them both down to allow the President to escape. The fight with Diaz is slightly disappointing. At this point in the game I was sick of the combat, but Diaz fights fairly, which means that we can just bait out his attacks, build meter and spam kicks. After defeating Diaz, the President comes back to rescue Johnny from the exploding base and they both escape. Upon reaching the subway on Christmas Eve, the President orders Johnny to go and keep his promise with Holly, to meet her under the tree. He declares that Johnny is now on vacation, effective immediately, and thanks him with a handshake and a hug. In a moment that scared the absolute shit out of me, we get voice acting between Johnny and the cab driver.
Where to?
Washington, D.C.
Oh, that's pretty far to go, ain't it?
I'm in a hurry. This way's faster than getting on a plane.
Leave it to me, man.
We interrupt this broadcast for breaking news. An astounding event has just taken place in New York City where President Weller was scheduled to address the nation tonight. The president was on the stage when he was attacked by a man, but it turned out that the assailant was, strangely enough, none other than President Weller himself.
After that cutscene, Johnny finally makes it back to Holly.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
We get a classic ranking screen, unlock hard mode, and that's the game. Hybrid Heaven is not a great game. It has pacing issues in both its story and combat, and forgettable characters that fill a pretty convoluted story. But calling it anything other than ambitious or interesting would be unfair. The story has all kinds of crazy twists. Presidential conspiracy, gene research, cloning, patriotism, Konami.
Wait a minute.